Before anyone in Edo stepped into a silk kimono, there was a woman making decisions about who they were allowed to be. Not a noble, not a stylist, an old woman in a cold room, alone with a loom and 1,000 threads that cannot be undone. In one short meeting, she reads you posture, silence, the things you try to hide. Then she chooses colors and ghost patterns that will sit on your skin for years. Tomoe's craft has one rule: there is no undo. Every intersection is a decision that, once made, can never be taken back. This is the life of Tomoe, the kimono weaver of Edo, the last guardian of silk. Edo, 1705. A master weaver named Tomoe sits before her loom in pre-dawn darkness, her hands remembering movements she learned 60 years ago. The loom is her entire universe, 20 feet of wood and string, each string a decision, each intersection a choice that cannot be unmade. A kimono is not clothing. A kimono is a conversation between the weaver and the person who will wear it, spoken through pattern, through color, through the specific intention woven into every thread. Every weaver makes mistakes, but in silk weaving, mistakes become permanent. Unlike painting, where the artist can paint over the error, or sculpture, where he can chisel away the mistake, the weaver must incorporate every accident into the final design. This is why Tomoe's concentration is absolute. This is why her hands move with the precision of a surgeon. Tomoe had an apprentice once, a girl named Yuki, who came to her at age 12 with hands that wanted to learn. For 5 years, Yuki learned the mechanics of weaving, how to throw the shuttle, to control tension, to recognize when thread is breaking before it happens. But 3 years into her apprenticeship, Tomoe realized Yuki was learning technique without understanding purpose. The girl's hands were fast, but in service to speed, not beauty. Tomoe knew precisely which colors to use for each person who commissioned a kimono. She would meet the person only once, briefly, asking no direct questions about preferences or specifications. But then she would read the client's age, station, spirit, and choose colors that would sing only for that person, colors that would become part of the essence once worn. The loom speaks in a language Tomoe understands completely. The resistance of threads pulling against each other, the slight variation in tension that reveals when it is about to break, the rhythm of shuttle passing that becomes meditation. If the weaver is not skilled enough, the loom defeats him, but if he has listened long enough, the loom becomes an extension of his body. Edo was a city of dramatic social change, and the kimono market reflected it. Wealthy merchants' wives competed with samurai wives for status through increasingly elaborate patterns and rarer dyes. Tomoe found herself caught between two paths. She could mass-produce simpler designs for growing merchant wealth, or she could continue her refined practice for a shrinking aristocracy. In her later years, Tomoe became obsessed with creating a pattern that would exist at the edge of visibility. Not hidden, but not obvious, a pattern that would reveal itself only to those who knew how to look, who understood that beauty could exist in subtlety. She called this obsession the ghost pattern, designed so refined that the untrained eye might miss it completely, but the trained one would find it magnificent. When Tomoe was 68, a woman came to commission a kimono unlike any requested before. The mysterious woman asked, "Can you weave a garment that knows who I will become in advance?" Tomoe understood immediately. This was not a commission for clothing. This was a commission for prophecy. For this final garment, Tomoe returned to the oldest techniques, natural dyeing methods that had been nearly abandoned for faster chemical dyes. Dyeing natural silk is alchemy, mixing plant materials, mineral compounds, and intention in precise ratios that Tomoe knew only through memory. Each batch of dye is unique, unrepeatable, and demands the dyer's complete presence. This cannot be controlled. It can only be guided and coaxed. The dyeing alone took 4 weeks. The preparation of thread took another 3. The actual weaving took nearly 4 months, longer than any kimono she had ever made. Time was no longer measured in hours or days, but in the gradual emergence of something that refused to be rushed. Tomoe reached a point in the weaving where she had to decide, was the work complete or should she continue? The kimono was already extraordinary. It would have been acceptable to finish it now. But she sensed that it was not yet what it needed to become. She felt the need to weave further, to add layers of pattern only she could see, to deepen the work beyond visible perfection. The final weeks of weaving were different from everything that came before. Tomoe was no longer trying to make a kimono, she was trying to make a garment that would somehow reveal its wearer to herself. Her hands worked from something beyond consciousness, from the accumulated wisdom of 60 years of listening to fabric and color. When Tomoe cut the final thread, she understood something she had known her entire life but never fully accepted. This work was her offering. She removed the finished kimono from the loom with hands that trembled from the weight of what she held. The garment shimmered with barely visible patterns, colors that changed depending on light, intention woven so thoroughly into the silk that the wearer would feel it without understanding it. The mysterious woman returned exactly as she had promised, at the completion point Tomoe had sensed but could not have calculated. She entered the workshop and asked simply, "Is it ready?" Tomoe handed her the kimono without words. There was no need for that. After the client left, Tomoe sat alone in her empty workshop and understood something she had sensed for years but never fully accepted. Her hands were approaching their final work. She had nothing left to prove, no further refinement to achieve, no deeper mastery to pursue. There was no sadness in this understanding. It was simply completion, the natural ending of a life spent in service to thread and color. Tomoe lived for 1 more year after completing her final commission, moving through the seasons without working. She enjoyed meditating and allowed her hands to finally rest. When young weavers occasionally came seeking apprenticeship, she turned them away with clear understanding that there was nothing left to pass on. In her final weeks, while approaching death, Tomoe took a single thread of the most precious silk she possessed, reserved for some undefined purpose. She wove it into a simple pattern, something smaller than usual, a reminder of what had animated her entire life. When she finished, she held it up to light and saw the thread shimmering with all the colors she had ever worked with, all the knowledge contained in her hands. Tomoe died at 73. The greatest kimono weaver of Edo passed into history unknown to most people. But the few who understand weaving recognize something unique in her work. Mastery is not about being seen, and the deepest work requires no audience. Intention woven into silk is carried by everyone who wears it, understood only by those who know how to listen. Every legend you've heard about samurai ends the same way, steel drawn, enemies charging, a final glorious death. This is the story of a man who never got that ending. He does the only thing he knows. He ties his kimono, steps onto the tatami, and moves through the same kata he has done since he was a child. That man keeps sharpening a blade for a war that ended before he was born. Some tried to turn their skills into a job. Others let the code turn into paperwork and tax ledgers. Many drank until they could call collapse freedom. This story is not about how a samurai dies. It's about what happens when he lives too long. Edo, 1720. A samurai wakes at 5 a.m. as he has every morning for decades. There's a bell ringing somewhere in the city. Not an alarm, not a call to war, just the bell at a nearby temple marking time. For the first time in his life, he wonders if that bell is ringing for him or if he's simply become part of the landscape it marks. His name is Tanaka Masahide, though you could replace it with 1,000 others. He was born into the samurai class in a year of chaos. His father died when he was 7, the way samurai were supposed to, with his sword in his hand and his honor intact. Tanaka learned that death with honor was the only death that mattered. He trained every day to make sure when his time came, he would be ready. Except that years of training had prepared him for exactly one thing: war. Edo had not seen real war in many years. He had become a master of something the world no longer needed. So Tanaka became what all samurai of Edo had become, an administrator. By day, he managed his lord's fiefs, oversaw tax collection, attended endless meetings with other officials. His sword hung at his side as a symbol of a status that no longer required the skill behind it. Which is why Tanaka still rose at 5 a.m., why he still trained for 2 hours before the city woke. He wasn't training for war anymore. It would never come. He was training because stopping would mean admitting that the life he dedicated himself to had become meaningless. Tanaka had inherited a code called Bushido: honor, loyalty, courage, the willingness to die for your lord. But the code was written for war, not for peace. In peace, a samurai became something harder to define, a man waiting for a purpose that might never come. Tanaka had a student, a young samurai, barely 20, named Kenji. Kenji trained with dedication, but not devotion. He performed his duty to his father, who was Tanaka's friend, but you could see the question in his eyes. Why was becoming a dangerous question in Edo. But Tanaka wasn't alone in his crisis. Edo had a growing population of ronin, masterless samurai whose lords had died or whose fiefs had been taken. Thousands of trained warriors with no one to serve, no purpose to anchor them. They were ghosts in the city, reminders of what samurai were supposed to be and what happened when you had nowhere to belong. One afternoon, Kenji asked Tanaka a question. Why do we still train? If there will be no war, why do we perfect these skills? Tanaka realized he'd been waiting many years to answer this, and he still didn't know how. Some samurai found a way out. They became swordsmen for hire, yojimbo, protectors for merchants and noblemen willing to pay. It was work, it was honorable in a way, and it let you pretend you still mattered. Tanaka had been offered this path 100 times. He'd never taken it. Tanaka's lord was Daimyo Shimazu, a reasonable man for a feudal ruler, which is to say he didn't ask his samurai to die needlessly. But he did ask them to maintain readiness, to keep training, to be prepared for scenarios that everyone knew would never occur. It was an instruction that sounded like duty but felt like pity. One morning, Tanaka received a letter from a man he hadn't heard from in 15 years. His name was Akira. He'd been Tanaka's friend in training until Akira had become a ronin. The letter was simple. I'm still alive, are you? Tanaka found Akira in a ryokan on the outskirts of Edo, in a room that smelled of sake and desperation. Akira had survived by doing what ronin do: bodyguard work, debt collection, the things that swords could still be used for. He'd aged 20 years in 15. Tanaka couldn't stop himself from asking the question that was in his mind. Do you regret becoming ronin? Akira looked at his sake cup for a long time before answering. I don't know if regret is the right word. Regret implies I had choices. Tanaka left Akira's room without a clear goodbye. They both knew they wouldn't meet again. Tanaka understood something he'd been avoiding. There were only 2 ways this could end. He could keep training, pretending purpose existed until he was old and then dead, or he could stop and admit the truth. That night, Tanaka read the Hagakure again, but this time he read it with the question that Kenji had asked, that Akira had embedded in his silence. The text spoke of honor and duty, the willingness to die at any moment. But what if that moment never comes? What if you die waiting? Edo held an annual tournament, samurai from different daimyo competing in swordplay. It was ceremonial, largely pointless, a way for the ruling class to pretend martial skill still mattered. Tanaka had never competed. At 45, he was approached by his daimyo and told it would honor the house if he participated. He understood this was a test to see if he could still perform, still be useful, still belong. In the final match, Tanaka faced a young samurai, barely 22, named Ichiro. Ichiro was brilliant, fast, fierce, believing in something that Tanaka had stopped believing in years ago. For the first time in the tournament, Tanaka felt something other than certainty. After the tournament, Tanaka's daimyo praised him. He offered him a position as tournament master for the following year. Tanaka accepted without enthusiasm. It was an honor, which is to say it was another cage. That night, something inside him finally broke. The next morning, Tanaka summoned Kenji to the dojo. He sat the young man down and asked him the question that Kenji had asked him: "Why do we train?" But this time, Tanaka didn't offer an answer. He asked it as a real question, and he waited for Kenji to fill the silence. A merchant had been following Tanaka for weeks. He finally approached him with an offer: hire protection for a trading caravan traveling the dangerous roads north. The pay was generous. The work was simple. It required Tanaka's skill and nothing else. No philosophy, no code, just practical violence when needed. For the first time, Tanaka considered saying yes. Tanaka refused the merchant's offer, but not because he was noble, not because he believed in his code. He refused because the moment he accepted, he would become someone else, someone he'd already seen, someone like Akira. There was no victory in that path. There was just a slower death wearing different clothes. And Tanaka continued training. He began to understand that the training wasn't preparation for anything anymore. It was the thing itself. It was what he did, and in some inexplicable way, what he was. The meaning hadn't been restored, but maybe it had never been the point. Many years later, Tanaka died in his sleep. He was 60 years old. He'd trained every morning without fail for decades. There was no great battle, no glorious death, just his body worn out. At his funeral, people spoke of his skill, his dedication, his honor. No one mentioned the terrible question that had lived inside him for the last years of his life. The dojo where Tanaka trained still stands, now a historical site. Young samurai still train there, performing forms that have become pure tradition, disconnected from their original purpose. The samurai of Edo had been created to serve a purpose that no longer existed. Some, like Akira, fell into ruin and called it freedom. Others, like Tanaka, stayed and called it duty, knowing the distinction had become meaningless. Both found a kind of peace, the peace of someone who has stopped asking why and simply accepts the price of continuing. When the samurai class was finally abolished 50 years later, no one had to tell them they were already dead. They'd been dying the whole time. The only question was whether you died asking why or whether you died refusing it. Either way, you died, and the bell continued ringing, marking time for those who came after.